Well, what we're saying is that there is a real culture of secrecy in this country, and that much information that Australian citizens should have the right to have access to, they don't at the moment because of overly secret provisions. A classic example, I think, is the recent ABC Four Corners expose of abuse and assaults in nursing homes. Australians should have the right to know where those assaults are taking place. If they're looking to place an elderly relative in a nursing home, why is it the case that the government hides the information about where these assaults have taken place?
And what's the process like of trying to get access to some of this information? And how would you describe the freedom of information regime in Australia?
It's incredibly frustrating. The culture of secrecy has got much worse in this country in recent years. Government agencies regularly overclassify documents, and they force journalists to go through lengthy and expensive procedures to try and get access to information that should be public. And then when it is issued, it's so heavily redacted that often it is useless.
And the media companies have to pay these bills that the government departments come up with as an estimate of how much it's going to cost. There was a recent one, I think, of someone trying to find out about a ministerial trip, and it was going to cost about $2,500 and 190 hours of work to find out how much this trip cost or something.
That's right. That's an example of a tactic that government agencies regularly use. They completely overestimate the hours it would take to process, and then they put a massive price on access to that information.
And when you see those kind of examples, how would you describe the system as it's working now?
It's not working. It's not working in the interest of the public. Australians elect governments. They have a right to have access to information about what those governments are doing in their name.
And just with that example, would it be fair enough to describe it as farcical at the moment?
Farcical, Orwellian. I mean, there's probably a number of terms you could come up with, but it is simply not working in favour of the public.
Yeah. And so you've got requests on a range of fronts here for the government to institute reforms to make journalists' job easier, or make it possible for journalists to effectively do their jobs. Is one of the keys defining what is in the public interest? When a journalist is able to use a public interest defence and not be prosecuted?
Well, one of the problems with the current legislation, I mean, we've had 75 separate pieces of national security legislation go through our parliament since 2001, which is extraordinary. It's the highest figure in the world. And it creates a range of new potential criminal offences for those who reveal information and those who publish information. At the moment, the defences that are available are weak, and they're also the wrong way around. What we say is there should be a presumption that there is a public interest in having access to information, and only if that public interest can be shown to have been overridden should it be prevented from being published. At the moment, the assumption in legislation is when something is published, there has been an offence, and then a very limited defence is provided.
What do you make of Scott Morrison's statements around this, that there can be no question about this government's commitment to press freedom?
Well, look, I think we're all getting a little tired of hearing politicians say how much they love press freedom. Words are cheap, actions are what count, and there have been no actions from this government to address the very serious legislative flaws that media organisations have repeatedly drawn to their attention.
Scott Morrison also says, when he's asked about this, that no one can be above the law. Do you concede there are cases where journalists should be prosecuted for what they've done?
I think that the history of media organisations in Australia shows a great degree of concern for the safety of their fellow citizens, and they don't publish information that brings their fellow citizens into danger. Morrison also says, the law has to apply equally to everyone. Of course it does, but that's a pretty glib statement. What we're saying is that the laws that are drafted need reform, that they are just drafted very inappropriately to prevent information coming to light.
Based on what the Prime Minister has had to say on this so far, though, it doesn't look like you're going to get very far with this campaign, does it?
I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist. This campaign is not going to stop. It is such an important issue for our democracy. This campaign will continue until we see action from our parliament.